Okay, so we're meeting for our 10 a.m. check-in for October 15th. This session is going to be recorded. Let's see. So what we're going to be doing today, we go over the agenda, as I always do, to communicate to you why we do these meetings. It's an opportunity for me to go over some key information for the week, as well as provide you guys an opportunity to ask some questions of me. So also note that using the chat feature, please go on there now and see me, the host, that you are present for today's session. So when I get around to getting you guys some points for attending these sessions, I won't miss you guys. Please go ahead and do that now. I'll try to remind you as we go on during this presentation. Okay, so that's what we're here to do today. I also take the opportunity to remind you of a couple of other things that I think are important for us to remember. The activities and the course flow for this course this semester, reading the textbook chapters ahead of time, completing the chapter quiz homeworks, review and annotate the lecture notes that are provided for you as well, and then also take the opportunity either before we have these check-in sessions or shortly after, look at the recorded lecture videos, as well as participate in just demonstrating that you've been listening to those videos, and make a comment as outlined in discussion sections. All right, we also have those other videos from Crash Course, for example, and then we have some standalone discussion forums too, which are given to you throughout the semester, and those are the ones that are already outlined in your syllabus. Okay, and after this particular session, shortly after, we'll see that the exam, which will be covering 2 chapters this unit, will be posted for you guys, covering chapter 10 and chapter 12. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at chapter 12 of social psychology. Last week we looked at motivation. So now we're going to be looking at what is social psychology, how we think in relation to other people, meaning that we are very interested in people around us. We're very social creatures. And when people do certain things, when they behave in certain ways, we always want to attribute a cause to that. We'll also look at how other people influence our thinking and actions. We'll be examining such things as conformity, obedience, and group behavior. And then we'll examine how we treat each other and relate to each other, looking at and examining such things as prejudice, aggression, and pro-social relations. So let's get started. First, it's about attribution. And what we mean by attribution is trying to attribute cause. Why is it that somebody does something? Why does your best friend behave this way, or your boyfriend or girlfriend behave that way? Why are they doing the things that they're doing? And attribution is something that we all do. We try to attribute a reason to why somebody behaves the way they do. And that's a key aspect of social psychology. Attribution, the process of attributing cause. So attribution is looking for the cause of a behavior or an event. Okay, now what we do is we can break it down into one of 2 reasons. We can look first at the situation. Situational attribution is basically saying the reason that someone behaved that way is because of external factors outside the person, meaning it's not the person's character, or bad character or good character. It's not who they are. It's because of some outside force that caused them to do what they did, to behave in a certain way. So that's situational disposition, situational attribution. Then we have dispositional attribution. And what disposition is a fancy way of saying internal factors or personality characteristics. So what we mean by dispositional, these are factors associated with the person. Okay, they're internal to that person. It's who they are. So basically, when we see some sort of behavior, we can attribute to a situational cause or a dispositional or personal cause, something that is either external to the person, situational, or internal to the person, dispositional. And we do that all the time. You can think back to numerous things when you saw someone behave a certain way. You always want to say, why did they do that? And that is you attributing some sort of reason for that particular behavior, identifying a situational or dispositional. Now, another thing that we need to also understand is that sometimes when we make attributions, we make errors in doing those attributions. And so what we see here is that there's something that we see specifically of Western cultures, and we are Western culture. We have an individualistic culture here in the United States, okay, and Canada and a lot of places in Europe, they have the same type of Western culture. And these individuals that have grown up in these Western cultures, they commit an error called the fundamental attribution error. And what this error is, it's an error in how it is that we attribute causes to things. First, let me give you a little bit of background about an individualistic and collectivist culture. We may have mentioned those before a couple of times. An individualistic culture like ours means that we tend to see things from the individual's perspective. We are more interested in the I and the me, okay? We want to be first, okay? Someone from a collectivist culture, an Eastern culture, an Asian culture, for example, they may be more collectivist. They don't automatically first think about I or me. They think more about we and us. So they see things more of a group mentality, whereas we are more about the individual, okay? So what this fundamental attribution error is this. We, in Western cultures, tend to overemphasize the role of the person or the disposition or dispositional factors when we're looking at causes. So we tend to see more when somebody behaves a certain way, we're more prone to say it's because of who they are, their personality, their particular traits, the character of that person. So we overemphasize the person or dispositional factors and tend to underemphasize the situational or external factors. So people from our culture, a Western individualistic culture, that's what we do. We don't see this fundamental attribution error in other cultures like Eastern cultures. They don't tend to overemphasize the importance of the dispositional factors as we do and underemphasize the situational factors. But we do that here. So our cultures play a significant role in how we see the world in many ways. Now, another aspect to this attribution is the actor-observer effect or the self-serving bias. This is sort of like the fundamental attribution error sort of flipped inside out in a way. And what this basically means, if, for example, you see someone drive through a red light at an intersection, you have choice words from them. For them, you think of them as a scofflaw. They think they're very special. They can break the rules. Okay, and that's us committing the FAE or fundamental attribution error, because we're saying that behavior was due to who they are as a person. But when we are the ones who run through that red light, then we have the actor-observer effect or self-serving bias. And what this basically says is this: we will blame the situation, external factors, for our failures or our shortcomings. So when we run through that red light, we can come up with a reason that's not based on our personality and who we are as individuals, but some outside factor that caused us to run that red light. So we blame the situation for our failures. The other thing that we see too is this: when we have successes, we take credit for those. So anytime we fail at something, we can blame it on something else. But if we succeed at something, that's because of who we are. So this actor-observer bias, this self-serving bias here, we do this for ourselves and for our close friends. So there's a benefit of being a close friend with somebody. You can give them sort of a benefit of a doubt. So if they have some sort of failure or some sort of major shortcoming, you can say it was the situation. If they have some sort of great success, it's because they're good people. That's what that basically means. Now, I have a bonus item here I want to talk about. It's called self-handicapping. And sometimes people will self-handicap. And what this is a cognitive strategy by which people publicly make advanced external attributions for an anticipated failure. For example, you have a really big exam, an in-class exam the next day, and you tell all your friends that morning that you were sick all night before. You were sick, you were throwing up and all this type of stuff. So let me ask you this. If you tell all your friends that you were sick, throwing up all night last night and you're about ready to go and take this big exam. What happens if you fail the exam? Can anybody tell me what happens if you fail the exam? Either send it through chat or just speak up. What happens now if you fail that exam?
What exam are we talking about? Like a college exam?
Yeah, a
A
college
journal
exam. So
exam?
you told all your friends the night before this big exam that you were really sick. So when you take that exam, what happens if you fail that exam? What can you do?
Why does everybody has a camera on?
I can probably hope that I did my other assignments well.
Well, what it comes down to is this. Why we are doing this self-handicapping is to protect our ego. So if we tell everybody the night before that we were really sick, we were throwing up, if you fail that exam, they don't say it's because you failed and you're not a good person, you don't know how to do the work. They say you failed the exam because guess what? You were sick. So you've already gone ahead and pre-planned an excuse for potential failure. Okay. Now, what happens if you tell all your friends and family that you were really sick the night before, you were throwing up, even threw up that morning before the exam? You take the exam and you do wonderfully on the exam. What can you tell them then? Well, I'll go ahead and help you out. What they can say is this: even this fact that I think my heart stopped last night, and maybe this morning when I was throwing up in the bathroom before I went to take this exam, I still passed that exam. So it makes them seem even better. So with this self-handicapping and this self-serving bias, we do things to make us come out okay. So we protect ourselves for in case we fail, and we make ourselves seem even better if we succeed, despite the fact that we were really, really sick that morning and the previous night. So that's some of the things that social psychology does for us. It helps to protect us as well. All right, so that gives us an idea of what we mean by attribution, that we attribute either situational or dispositional causes to our behaviors. We also note that we have this fundamental attribution error that makes us overemphasize one factor and underemphasize another. But when we are the ones who has a shortcoming or a failure, we always tend to say the failures are due to situational factors and any success we have is due to who we are as a person. So obviously we can see that there's a potential bias there for us. Now, in addition, as we go through this idea of social psychology, there's another aspect of it as well that we need to talk about. And this is our attitude, okay? Our attitude. And what we mean by an attitude is the feelings, ideas, and beliefs that affect how we approach and react to other people, objects, and events. Our feelings about these things, our ideas about these things. We have an attitude of positiveness about this particular person or this particular situation. So that attitude is very important. But sometimes we need to note that our attitude will have an impact on our actions, okay? So first, let's talk about how it is that we can persuade people. We have these cognitive pathways that can affect our attitudes. And what we're talking about here is how we get persuaded. When somebody tries to persuade you, there's one or two ways they can do it. They can go through what they refer to as the central route of persuasion, or they can go the peripheral route of persuasion. And what the central route of persuasion is basically this. They'll attempt to use logic and rationality to try to persuade you. So they'll talk about facts, statistics, and numbers. And that can be effective, all right? Another route they can take is the peripheral route. Here, they're going to bypass logic and rationality altogether. They're going to try to get to your emotion. Okay, and so these are two legitimate ways in which you can persuade somebody: by using logic and rationality, or by using emotion, getting their emotions and their feelings revved up. Now, obviously, the key thing is this: one is going to be a little bit more difficult than the other. In order to get somebody to be persuaded to have a certain type of attitude about something or take certain actions, if you use the central route, they have to pay attention to it. They have to be smart enough in a way to pay attention to what you're saying, be interested enough to keep focusing on it so they can understand the logic connections that you're making. So it's going to be a lot more difficult sometimes to get the people to be persuaded by using logic and rationality. But the easier thing to do is to use the peripheral route, to use emotion. Okay, and this political time that we're going through now, we see this stuff being used all the time. So when you see a lot of statistics, people are trying to get you to understand, to use logic and rationality. When you're seeing children in dire circumstances or people being beat up by criminals, whatever, that's the peripheral route. They're using emotion there to try to persuade you. So the idea here is that with emotional arguments to try to persuade an individual, they can happen rather easily, but they don't last as long sometimes. So you have to keep going back to try the emotional appeal again and again. Whereas if you win them over through logic and rationality, once you've got them, it sort of lasts a lot longer. Before I move on from that, are there any questions about the central route or peripheral route? You may have heard of this sometimes as this: winning the hearts and minds. Winning the heart is the peripheral route, and winning the mind is sort of the central route to persuade you. So I'll pause there to see if there are any questions, comments, or anything like that before I move on. Okay, no comments and no chat messages for me. Okay, so that takes us to this next thing. When do attitudes affect our actions? Okay, and what we know from the research is this: our attitudes will influence how we behave, how we act, when the external influences are minimal, meaning that there's no one there to counter some attitude that you have. The example I believe I gave in the presentation is, let's say you feel like you want to go to McDonald's, but you know the food there is not necessarily going to be healthy for you, so you don't have anybody telling you or whispering in your ear that you need to watch your fat intake, and therefore you need to avoid going to McDonald's. So we don't have the external influences trying to talk us out of it. So if we don't have that external influence, then we're more likely to let our attitudes lead to us going to McDonald's, for example. Then the other one is our attitude is stable, okay? Meaning that you have a good familiarity, for example, with that fast food restaurant, McDonald's, for example, that you want to go to. You have a great deal of positive vibes and feelings and ideas and beliefs about that place, therefore, no big problem. The other thing is the attitude is specific to the behavior, basically meaning that you, it's easy to get, you have enjoyed the food in the past, therefore it shouldn't be a problem. You know that this will satisfy your hunger need, that desire and that drive that you have. So we have external influences are minimal, the attitude is stable, the attitude is specific to a particular behavior, and then the attitude is easily recalled. That means that when you are hungry, one of the first things you think about, you see the golden arches and McDonald's sign, is that thing. Therefore, the attitude is easily recalled. Then with all those factors in play, you're more likely to let that attitude influence your behavior, your actions. And again, to a large degree, that's what advertisements are all about. They're trying to make you feel positive about their sign, the decor of their restaurant, so that you get these positive vibes and positive attitudes about these things. And such that when you're hungry, one of the first things you think about is how well you like that particular type of food from that particular type of restaurant. That's when they've been rather successful in trying to persuade you to act out and buy a certain type of food. Okay, so that is when attitudes impact our actions. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is when actions affect our attitudes. And this is a key idea to remember. So attitudes lead to actions. That's true. And we just saw that slide to talk about that. But the opposite is true as well. Actions can change your attitudes. It sounds kind of backwards in a way, but we'll see why that is. So actions can affect your attitudes. For example, we have the foot in the door phenomena. The foot in the door phenomena goes way back to a long time ago when you used to have door-to-door salesmen. And the idea would be they would be selling vacuum cleaners, for example, to the housewives who are at home. And they knock on the door, and as soon as the door opens, the housewife sees the person. They know it's a salesperson, and they're trying to speak to the wife. And all of a sudden, they're closing, the door's been closed on them. And what they do is they put their foot in the door to stop it. So that's where that comes from, foot in the door phenomenon. Now, what this really talks about by way of the phenomena of foot in the door is this: the tendency to be more likely to agree to a large request after agreeing to a small one. That is often why sometimes what you'll see when somebody comes to your door, let's say a college student selling magazine subscriptions, for example, during the summer. They knock on the door, ring the doorbell, the door opens. And one of the things they may ask of the person who's opened the door is, can I have a drink of water? It's really hot out here. Okay, if the person is relatively nice and situations being what they are, that it's okay, they may let them in or at least give them a glass of water. Now, what has happened is this: the person, the salesperson, has made a request, and you, the potential customer, has agreed to that request. And what that means is this: since you have agreed to that request, you're more likely to agree to the next request. That's all it really comes down to. So this is based on the premise of this: liking the people they agree to help and disliking the people they agree to harm. The idea is very simple. When you see yourself behaving in a way that indicates that you may like somebody, then your attitude becomes more liking toward them. If you're behaving in a way that seems to suggest that you are not liking this person, then your attitude gets up there too, so you don't like them. Another idea would be this: if you've ever gone to a car dealership, foot in the door is going to be something like this. You're there just to browse around at the cars. And a lazy Saturday afternoon, you're just going to be walking around the cars. The salesperson shows up and gets you into a conversation. You know how they do. And then they say, hey, you want to sit in the car? And you say, no, no. They say, come sit in the car. And so they get you sitting in the car. The next thing you know, what they're going to ask you, do you want to start the car up? And you agree to it. And so what you're doing, you keep agreeing and agreeing until the next thing you know, you're driving a car on a test drive. And the next thing you know, you're sitting in the office getting ready to purchase a vehicle. Let me ask you out there, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Has anything like this ever happened where you're talking to a salesperson and then slowly and slowly they pull you in, the next thing you know, you're purchasing some sort of item? I'm going to pause to see if anyone knows anything about what I'm talking about. Anyone?
I know what you're talking about, but like I've never.
It hasn't happened to you yet. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But it does happen. It's happened to me a couple of times, you know. But the idea is that even when you know it's going on, because, you know, I teach this stuff, but even when you know what's going on, you can't really help it. You sort of get caught up in it. And so foot in the door phenomena, key thing I want you to remember is this: it's about getting someone to agree to one of your requests. And when they agree to one of your requests, it's more likely that you will agree to a larger request they'll make a little bit later. And that's the way we're sort of programmed, and that's the way it seems to work, this foot in the door phenomenon. Now, the other thing that shows how actions can affect our attitudes is going to be this other concept of role playing. And role playing is when you have a certain character, somebody gives you a little bit of a description of somebody, say this is the person that you're going to play. And that's what role playing is, okay? And there was this classic study by Philip Zimbardo. You might have seen a movie on it. There's a movie out there. It's based on the Stanford prison studies, okay, where they got some college students to role play either being a prison guard or being prisoners. And the study was supposed to last for 2 weeks, okay? They had to stop the study after a few days because things got out of hand. But the key point I would uncover is this: when we play a role, even when we know we're just pretending, we eventually tend to adopt the attitudes that go with that role. We sort of become the role. So what happened in this classic experiment, the prisoners started to hate the guards. Even though they were pretending to be prisoners, they adopted the attitudes, okay, because they were acting like prisoners. They adopted the attitudes of prisoners. And the prison guards did the same thing. They adopted the attitude about prison guards, and then they also adopted the attitude about the prisoners that they were in charge of. And they became too extreme. The guards became very sadistic. The prisoners became very unruly. And even Philip Zimbardo, who was the researcher, who was also acting out the role of the prison warden, lost his perspective too. He forgot that he was supposed to be a researcher and thought for a while he was a prison warden. And their attitudes and actions really did change. So what we see in this experiment that Zimbardo did, and he did it because he wanted to examine brutality in prisons and things of that nature. What he was able to uncover is when we play roles, we can get really lost in those roles that we play. So in a way, we may pretend to be a certain individual, but after a while, we can sort of become that individual and have those attitudes and actions as well that are associated with that individual. Okay, so what we see with actions affecting attitudes, we see the foot in the door phenomenon, we see role playing as indicated by the classic Philip Zimbardo study, and then we see cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is basically this idea that we get dissonance, sort of a discord, when our actions disagree with our attitudes. So when we behave in ways that go against the attitudes that we have espoused to other people that we believe about ourselves. And what that basically means, if our actions and our attitudes are unaligned, it causes sort of a tension in us. This dissonance is what it's called. So we don't feel comfortable when that happens. And so what cognitive dissonance theory is this: the observation that we tend to resolve this dissonance by changing our attitudes to fit our actions. What this basically means is this: when we have behavior that we're doing and we keep doing that behavior, if we keep doing that behavior based on a previous chapter that we covered on learning, if a behavior is being maintained, that tends to suggest that the behavior is being reinforced by something. That's why we keep doing the behavior. So if we have this cognitive dissonance, we have to change something. We're not going to change the behavior or the action, because if we keep doing it, it's being reinforced somehow. Therefore, the only thing that can change is going to be our attitude. And that's what cognitive dissonance theory says. Our attitude will change so that we no longer are in dissonance about our actions and our attitudes disagreeing with one another. I think in the lecture for this week, I talked about Fiona, and Fiona always believed that her tuition was too high at college, but then she got a job doing fundraising for the school. So now she's getting paid to fundraise. So that causes cognitive dissonance in her. She's aware that she had this attitude about the school has enough money, tuition's too high, but now she is actively trying to go out there and get people to give money to the school. That causes dissonance. And so something has to change. We're going to assume that she's getting paid for this job of fundraising. So that's going to be the reinforcer. So that behavior is not going to change. She wants to get paid. So what has to change, according to cognitive dissonance theory, is her attitude about what the college needs. So maybe the school has a point. Maybe they do need this extra money. And that's how her attitude would change as well. I'm going to pause there, see if there are any questions or comments before we move on to the next topic. You can send it via chat or jump in on your microphone. Okay. All right, so what we've covered there is the idea of actions influencing our attitudes. Now let's talk about something referred to as social influence. Now, social influence is going to be how other people in some way or manner influences our behavior. The first thing we talk about here is conformity. And we all conform in one way or another. Conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to fit in with a group standard. What this basically means is that we first have to know what the group standard is. You go to a new school as a high school student, for example, and it's in a different state, okay, different type of environment than you're used to. You'll soon figure out what the group standard is, and usually what people will do, they will start to adjust their behavior and or thinking to fit in, okay, because we do tend to want to fit in. So that's what conformity is, us changing to some extent to fit in with some identifiable group standard. Now, there's a couple of ways that this happens. One of them is mimicry. We have the chameleon effect, which is unintentionally mirroring other people. Sometimes when you find yourself talking to somebody and they are moving their hands a lot, for example, okay, you may find that you tend to move your hands a little bit as well, okay? There, you're sort of mimicking them to an extent. You also see this too when some people, there's certain type of behaviors that are contagious. For example, when somebody yawns in front of you, you tend to yawn as well. Somebody rubs their face, you may tend to rub your face as well. You may have noticed these things before. This is because of this desire that we have there to conform to a degree, and we have this sort of mimicry system involved in us. And also, in addition to the chameleon effect, we also have the empathic effect as well. The empathic shifts in mood that fit mood of the people around us. So when we see people tend to be in a certain mood, we tend to try to adjust ourselves to be in that same mood as well. Oftentimes when we do this type of stuff, when we start to mirror other people, that not only their behaviors but their mood, it's a way for us to make a connection with them too. So it's sort of like a real subtle way that says, I'm not that different from you. I behave in a similar way. So it's a way that we can sort of socially connect as well. So that is one way that we can see conformity, is through this mimicry. But then we have this other idea, responding to social norms. And this is where we see the study, the classic study by Solomon Asch, his conformity studies. When we are with other people and perceive a social norm, a correct or normal way to think or behave in this particular group, our behavior may follow the norm rather than following our own judgment. And what this basically means is this: even if you know something that a group is doing is wrong, that it's not what you would do, left to your own devices, you may give up on what you would normally do, given your own devices, while you're with this group, and do what the group does, despite the fact that you know that this is something that you normally would not do. This could be something, for example, of maybe you see somebody you're with a group and you see members of your group picking on some other person at school, for example. You know that normally if you were by yourself and you saw this happen, you might jump in there, but you don't, because you realize the people that you're with, unfortunately or not, may see this as something that goes against what they want you to do. So the notion is that we will respond and do whatever the group wants us to, despite what we know. Now, in the classic Solomon Asch studies, they had a group of lines. They would have this standard line and then show you some other lines, comparison lines. And you were simply to select which line was equivalent to the standard. And what they would do is they would have like 4 or 5 people in the room. 4 of the people would be working with the experimenter, that meaning they were working with the researcher, and only 1 of them would be the true subject of the experiment. So they would do a few trials in which they acted appropriately, meaning they would select the correct comparison line to the standard line. So they would do the right, select correctly. But then in other conditions, what they would do is they would have the group make the wrong decision, the obvious wrong decision. They selected a line which was not equivalent to the standard line. They were not the same size at all. What they want to see then is, what would that true subject of the experiment do? Would they say, you guys are wrong, that's not the right line, or would they agree? And what they saw, a good plurality of the people would tend to agree with the correct answer, even if they knew it was the wrong answer. So that's what conformity is, okay, is that you will conform to this group standard despite your own judgment. Now, this conformity is going to be more likely under the following conditions. One, you're not firmly committed to whatever course of action, okay? The group is medium-sized, not too small of a group. It's a medium-sized group. You like the group, so the group is also admired. And you have this feeling too that if you non-conform, if you disagreed with them, you'd probably have some consequences for that. So that sort of prevents you from wanting to do that. And then the final one is if you're from a culture that encourages respect for norms. Now, our culture does have a respect for some norms, but we also are a very individualistic culture. So we may tend not to conform as much as somebody from another culture. So we're from a Western culture. We may be less conforming than somebody, let's say, from Eastern culture or an Asian culture, okay? But that's what it comes down to. So when it comes to conformity and responding to social norms, we see that we may go against our own beliefs for a group norm under those particular situations. Not firmly committed, medium-sized group, the group is admired. If we don't conform, we may get punished, and the culture encourages respect for our norms. Then we look at one other aspect of social influence, the types of social influence. Why is it that somebody may agree to forego their own beliefs and agree with the group? So one is going to be normative social influence. And this is what we saw in the ASH studies. They want to seek approval and avoid disapproval. So when you have that new student to the school, at a high school, a new student just moved into town, and they are trying to fit in, they're going to conform their behavior because they are seeking approval from that group, and they're trying to avoid disapproval. So it's normative social influence. We also have informational social influence. This basically means that others' ideas may make sense. So you have an idea maybe, but they have an idea that you think makes more sense than yours. Or you may believe they have more information than you have, therefore you agree with them. You conform to whatever decision they come up with. You know, it's almost like when you walk onto a scene and there's something going on, and when the person starts looking at the other members of the group that are standing around milling about, you're looking into their faces to see what they may be giving you by way of information because you don't have any. So that's sort of what this is here. You're trying to make a decision about what to do, and you may believe they have more information than you do, and that's what informational social influence means there. Okay, any questions so far, people? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
So for group conformity, wouldn't that like suggest that we're all susceptible to like peer pressure?
Definitely, we are. Everyone will be, and that's one of the key things about social psychology, as we'll see, especially when we go to the next topic here. But yes, we all are going to be influenced by other people and by peers. We cannot avoid it. Even when you have people that want to be lone rangers, okay, dressed totally different than most of the school, they usually wind up hooking up with other people who do the same thing. So you have a bunch of people who are not part of the standard dressing code, but they're dressing similar to each other. So they find their own little group. Okay, they're like a subculture in a way within the high school. But yeah, peer pressure is very powerful. Even when we're talking about fully grown adults at work, there's peer pressure. So these things are real, they are significant, okay, that these people will have a great deal of influence on our behavior. And as we see, as we move to this next topic of Stanley Milgram's obedience studies, we can see it can be a very, very powerful thing. All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, all right. So we've talked about conformity. Now we're going to talk about obedience. And obedience is basically when you command somebody, do this. You say, do this, and they do it. That's when they are obeying you. They're being obedient. All right. And so let me give you a little bit of background about Stanley Milgram and why he had this question. So Stanley Milgram was interested in this because this was shortly after World War II. Okay. And it became clear after World War II that there was a lot of atrocious things that occurred during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. And a lot of things went on that the German people had to have some knowledge of. And so people were saying, well, what happened? They were a civilized society. What occurred? Were there something wrong with the German people, or is there something that we don't know? So Stanley Milgram wanted to find out what are the conditions, okay, under which people are going to obey commands, particularly commands to hurt somebody who's innocent. So the question was, under what social conditions are people more likely to obey commands? That was the thing that Stanley Milgram was very interested in. So he devised an experiment. He had an authority figure tell participants to administer shocks, electrical shocks, to a learner. Okay, somebody that they met that was identified as a learner. Now, this person who was the learner was actually a confederate of the researcher. Remember, a confederate of a researcher is somebody who's working with the researcher. They're pretending to be something that they are not. They're pretending to be a subject like the real subject. Okay, but they're not telling anybody that. So they're pretending to be someone just like the subject they're interested in. So what happened is this: an authority figure tells participants to administer a shock to a learner when the learner gives a wrong answer. Okay, so as you can see in the diagram to the right here, you have three individuals. The person that has the call box that says ow, that person is identified as the learner. So what they have done is they show the subject, the teacher, they strap the person down, they put their hand on this electrical gizmo so that when they flip a switch in the other room, they will receive an electric shock, and therefore, ow, is why he says that. All right. And so what would happen is this: they'd go through many trials of this, and the learner would get some things right, but then they'll start to get things wrong. And the person would have to flip a switch. At the very bottom, you see the shock levels in volts that the participants thought they were giving. 15 to 60, slight; moderate shock; strong; very strong; intense shock; extreme intensity shock; danger, severe shock; and then XXX, sort of like a major shock there. So every time they got something wrong, they would have to flip the next switch. All right. Even when the learners would say stuff like, I want to stop this experiment, please stop, please stop, the researcher, the authority figure there, would say something like this: the experiment must continue, please continue. And then they say, okay, it's your responsibility, but they flip the switch anyway. All right. Even when they would go silent for a while and the teacher would get very agitated, say, hey, we need to go check in on that guy, he's not making any noise, the authority figure would say something like, the experiment must continue, please administer the shock. And then they would give the shock again. So that was the layout of this experiment that Stanley Milgram devised. So they want to find out, what would people do? How many people would keep giving the shock all the way up to XXX? Okay, and these are the results. How many kept giving the shocks? Over 65% of the people, the majority of the participants, continued to obey to the very end, delivering the shock of XXX 435 to 450 volts. That's what they did. So these individuals were surveyed before they participated in this experiment, and they were not seen as being psychotic or having some sort of neurological issues or anything like that. So they were normal, everyday people who had answered an ad in the newspapers and whatnot to participate in this particular experiment. So that's what they said, and this is what happened. All right, any comments about this so far, or any things that you want to have clarified? Okay, so what this comes down to is the following. So the results were somewhat shocking to the world in the psychology community, and they did versions of this study and found the results basically the same. But we see that obedience is not always going to be the same under every single condition. And we'll go over these in a second as to what factors led to an increase in obedience. Okay. And by the way, this experiment, if it's done today, it would have to have changes to it because it would not fit the same ethical guidelines that we have today. All right, so when orders were given by, this is when we see an increase in obedience, when orders were given by someone with legitimate authority, so you had to perceive the person as being someone who had legitimate authority to be giving you orders. That was one of the key things. Someone associated with a prestigious institution. So what they did at one point, they had the study done at a prestigious university, or they had it done at a strip mall, a rundown strip mall in a bad part of town. So when they did it in a bad part of town at a non-prestigious place, obedience would go down. So it had to be at a prestigious institution before we get the most extreme obedience, all right? Someone was standing close by, meaning that the authority figure, the most obedience we would see is when the authority figure was in the room with the person flipping the switch. Okay, so the further away this authority figure was, the less obedient people became, which sort of makes sense. All right. The other thing too, when the learner and victim is in another room, so they saw that obedience was high when the victim was not close to the person who was doing the hurting. Now, in other conditions, when they got the victim, the learner victim, in the same room with the person flipping the switch, obedience would go down, which makes sense. Now the person that you're actually hurting, you can actually see them respond to the electric shock. The other condition would be this: when other participants obey and no one disobeys. So this is one of the key things too that we need to understand. If someone stands up and says, no, I'm not going to do it, that has just been a role model for defiance. So if there's no one there to defy the authority, then we have high obedience. But if there is somebody there, let's say another subject, and they say no, then the other person in the same room, the other subject in the same room, may also say no, they will not obey, because now they have a role model for defiance. Okay, so that's when obedience would sort of decrease. Now, a couple of other things I want to point out too. The power of the situation is phenomenal. People can get caught up in situations that they wind up doing things that they probably never thought they would do. All right. But the key thing here is that in the research of obedience studies and looking at historical facts, particularly with people who lived in Germany during the time of World War II, that you never start off doing anything bad or letting bad stuff happen around you. It really happens in small steps or incrementally. So it's almost like the foot in the door phenomenon in a way, where you do one little thing, which leads to you doing a little greater thing, and then a greater thing, and then a greater thing, until you see you're doing some really bad stuff. So that's what it comes down to. You can imagine during the ramp up to World War II, as the Nazi Party took control of Germany, and they would ask neighbors to identify their fellow neighbors that happen to be Jewish. They just say, let's identify who the Jewish people in your town or in this block, and they identify them. They say, well, can you identify what businesses they own, or do they have any relatives? So they kept doing more and more until they were probably participating in things that they probably wouldn't have done given the different circumstances. But at the same time, realize this: when people control the government and control the military and the police and all this type of stuff, and you are one person and you know that they're doing something that's wrong, the question I have to you, what would you do? Would you say, no, I'm not going to tell you? They would then probably hurt you. So the idea here is that the situation will dictate to a large degree how people behave, and they may wind up doing things they never thought that they would. All right. So what this leads to next, our lessons from conformity and obedience studies is this. When under pressure to conform or obey, ordinary principled people will say and do things they never would have believed they would do. To look a person committing harmful acts and assume that the person is cruel or evil is very much akin to committing the fundamental attribution error. And the real evil may be in the situation. Because oftentimes you may find yourself between a rock and a hard place in certain situations that you don't know what to do because both options are really, really bad or dangerous to you. Therefore, you have to do something and you do it. But it may be something that you may have difficulty living with to a large extent. So that's what we've learned from the conformity and obedience studies conducted by Ash and Milgram and many others, that the situation has a very powerful influence on our behavior. And sometimes we may wind up doing things that we never thought that we would. Okay. All right. So I'll pause there for a second to see if there are any other questions or comments as we go to the next topic here. This next topic is about group behavior. When we have other people around us and how the presence of other people has some impact on our behavior. The first idea is that of social facilitation. We talked about social facilitation in the last lecture when we talked about motivation, that social facilitation can enhance whatever tendency you have when it comes to your eating behavior. That's when we mentioned it last time. Now we're talking about social facilitation and individual performance. So social facilitation and individual performance is intensified when you are observed by others. So when you are doing something and other people are around, it will intensify you to some extent. And what this means is this. If you are expert at something, if you're really good at some sort of behavior, experts will excel. People doing simple activities show more speed and endurance in front of an audience. So if you are expert at something or doing a very simple activity and other people are around, you will be more speedy and have more endurance in front of other people. The idea here is that it sort of increases your motivation. But novices, people who are not really good at these things, if you're a novice, not really good at a certain behavior or trying something very complex and other people are around you, you tend to do worse. And the idea behind that is that you have more anxiety, and anxiety, that stress that comes with anxiety, is going to degrade your performance. So if you know it well and you are an expert at it already, then you're going to raise your level of performance to a whole nother level. And you see this with professional athletes, basketball players, you know, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, those type of individuals. They love being in the spotlight. They love having the last second shot. And when they have a lot of people watching them, they take their game or took their game to a higher level. Okay. When you get that person who's in the audience at halftime, who's an accountant and hasn't played basketball in 20 some odd years, and they tell them to come down to the court and go to the free throw line and try to sink a basket for $1 million, they're going to have a tough time doing it. Okay, because they would be considered a novice. It may be difficult for them, and with all the people there and the stress of the money being on the line here, they'll most likely throw up an air ball or brick. All right, so that's what social facilitation is. It can facilitate one's performance up or facilitate it down. The other thing too that I'm sure you guys are very aware of is social loafing. The tendency of people in a group to show less effort when not held individually accountable. So when you have those group projects and you get a group grade, there's usually sometimes someone who's not going to put forth a lot of good effort. They're just going to coast. They're going to loaf, okay? And so why does social loafing happen? It happens for a variety of reasons. When your contribution isn't rewarded or punished, you might not care what people think, so you don't do anything. The other one might be people may not feel their contributions are needed, that the group will be just fine without their particular contribution. The other one could be people may feel free to cheat when they get an equal share of the rewards anyway. So this individual says, I'm going to get a good grade anyway because I know the people on this group is going to do well, therefore I'll just coast. So that's what we normally see. Now, note that people in collectivist cultures usually will not slack off as much as groups, even when they could. So the idea here is that the collectivist culture, because their idea, they're more about the group, the we and us, as opposed to the I and me that we have in individualistic cultures. The collectivist cultures, individuals, they tend not to slack off. They tend not to social loaf as those of us from more individualistic cultures. All right, questions, comments? All right, keep rolling on then. All right, so this next topic is one of de-individuation, and most people may not have heard of this before. This is what happens when people go nuts in crowds. That's just one way I sort of phrase it sometimes. People go nuts in crowds. A couple of things.
Sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to ask you, what section is this class?
This is section, well, it's both sections in here. So it's DO5 and DO6.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay, yeah. All right, so when it comes to this idea of de-individuation, it's basically this. When you become de-individualized, you have a loss of self-awareness and self-restraint. And what this means is you become less aware of your selfness, okay, of everything that makes you who you are. Your selfness, you sort of lose it a little bit. And then you also have less self-restraint. When you have lost yourself, there's no self, then you tend to be less restrained because you don't think of yourself as a self as much as you did before becoming de-individualized, and therefore you're more free. So what happens is this. You may have been in a situation where you've been around a really, really large group of people, okay? If you're in a really large group, let's say tens of thousands of people, let's say you're at some sort of big football game and there may be 20, 30,000 people around you. You get this really weird feeling sometimes. If you really focus on it, you'll realize it, is that you start to feel a little bit more anonymous. You feel lost in really big crowds. And that's your sense of self to a degree becoming a little bit less prominent in you. So you have this anonymity. And then you also have energy that someone comes from the group. So now what you have in this situation, you have anonymity, you're lost in the crowd, you're less self-restrained, okay? And that's why people can act stupid when they're in the crowds like this. You can see somebody on television do something really stupid. It gets recorded. They wouldn't have done it if they didn't get sort of caught up in it. They have the energy of the group. And then all it really takes is for somebody in that crowd to pick something up, let's say a rock or a brick, and throw it through a plate glass window of a business, okay? And then like little lemmings, people start to do similar types of behavior because they're open to it. So you've lost a sense of their self-identity. They are more, less restrained now. They have this energy level, and it's sort of like the idea of the spillover effect. Okay, what am I feeling? Well, I'm feeling a little aggressive because I just saw somebody throw a brick through a window. Maybe I would have do something like that too. And so the idea is that we have a bunch of people doing it, and then we have ourselves a riot. It may have started off as a celebration because a team won a college event, but now it turns into a riot. Does anybody understand what I'm saying here? I'll pause and see if somebody can give me either on chat or through audio here. Did you do?
Yes, I understand.
Thank you very much for helping me out there. I want to make sure you guys are still there. Okay. All right. So that's what we mean by de-individuation. And that's what happens when we see celebrations sometimes turn into riots or gatherings turn into this, because people get lost in anonymity that happens when you get into a large crowd, and the energy from the crowd permeates, and then we sort of lose our self-restraint. All right. Now, the other topic, something that is kind of close to home these days, because this has been going on for decades, is something called group polarization. When people of similar views form a group together, discussion within the group makes their views more extreme. Thus, different groups become more different, more polarized in their views. Now, a couple of ideas and examples here. For example, if we give somebody a survey of prejudice and we rate them on their level of prejudice, and then we get the low prejudice people together and the high prejudice people together, and they can have their discussions, and then we take a survey after they have that discussion, we'll see they would have become more extreme, meaning the low prejudice group became even lower in their prejudice, and the higher prejudice group became even higher in their prejudice. What happens is this: when you have like-minded individuals come together, they tend to reinforce their ideas. So people in these groups may have only encountered ideas reinforcing their views they already held. That's why we see polarization that we have today in society and politics, with left and right, conservative and progressive, because when they go to the websites and the blogs, they're going to the ones that are catered to their currently held beliefs, and so their beliefs become more and more extreme, and that's what group polarization does. It's sort of a tendency that we've been seeing for years now, and we're seeing the result played out in politics all around the world to a large degree. All right. Now, the other thing I want to talk about real quickly here is antisocial relations in prejudice. So prejudice is an unjustified, usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. So here you are prejudging somebody because they have an obvious membership into a particular racial or ethnic group you can identify. So that's what it comes down to. You are prejudging them because of their membership in a particular group. That is prejudice. It's an attitude that one may have. Discrimination is a behavior, an unjustified behavior selectively applied to members of a group. So usually it goes hand in hand. So you may have prejudice against one group, and then you discriminate against that group. That means you do something, you behave, you treat them differently because of that membership of that group. Now, in the background of all of this is going to be stereotypes. Okay, stereotypes is a generalized belief about a group applied to every member of a group. So you meet somebody for the very first time, but you know that they belong to a particular group. You go ahead and assume that this person that you're meeting for the very first time has all the characteristics of the stereotypical characteristics of members of that group. You are prejudging them. So what are the components of prejudice? The components of prejudice are this. We have these stereotypical beliefs, and many people, whether or not you believe in them or not, we all sort of know what the stereotypes are. Then we have these emotions that usually come along with it, things like hostility, envy, and fear. And then we have a predisposition to act or to discriminate. These are normally the components of prejudice. And normally, we really only generally care about discrimination. And what that means is this, because we don't know what really goes on in somebody's head, okay, until they're able to behave by using their words or their actions. Then we can see that that's discriminating. All right, so that's what we mean by these terms and how they sort of play together when it comes to prejudice. And prejudice, of course, has existed for a long time. It still maintains and will continue to exist as long as there are human beings. In our society, certain types of prejudice have gone down over the years. More overt prejudice has usually gone down. It's sort of rising a little bit now, I believe, for more subtle forms of prejudice and other types of discrimination. Now, why do we have prejudice? What are some of the roots of prejudice? One of them is going to be social inequality. When some groups have fewer resources and opportunities than others. Resources have limits to them, and sometimes it's going to be the fight over resources and having social inequalities that will cause the issue. It sometimes can breed contempt for people who are better off and disrespect for people who are less well off. So these inequalities sort of causes a have versus have-nots type of world to an extent. Those doing well must have done something right, so those suffering must have done something wrong. So those are some of the ideas that pop up when we do have these social inequalities. We also have this us versus them, this thing that naturally happens, in groups versus out groups. Whatever group you belong to, and they've done some really great research to demonstrate this. You can have a group that you can establish, say, I want to establish this group because you wore white tennis shoes and you wore dark tennis shoes. And so you've labeled white tennis shoes and dark tennis shoes. And you can form those two groups. And before you know it, those two groups will have bad attitudes about the other group. The research is incredible that this happens. It happens almost automatically. So what happens is no matter what the group identification is based on, you will start to favor one's own group, whether it be based on skin color, eye color, tennis shoes color, it doesn't really matter. Now, when that happens, we'll favor, so if I belong to the white tennis shoe wearing folks, I'll like those people who are members of that group. And I'll show more kindness toward that group. I'll do more favors for that group. But at the same time, I will misjudge other groups and quickly categorize strangers. So the idea here is this: those people who belong to the other category, I see them as all the same. They're cookie cutters of each other. So I paint them with one brush, so to speak. That's one of the things too that we see as part of our programming that sort of aids in our prejudicial attitudes. And then of course we have the scapegoat theory. The observation that when bad things happen, people want to find someone to blame. And what the Nazis did around the time of the 1930s, just prior to World War II, they convinced their population, or attempted to convince their population, that the problems that they were having in their economy at the time were the faults of the Jewish people. Okay, that was basically a classic scapegoat theory. Things are going wrong and bad things are happening, you want to find a group to blame. All right, and so the same thing happens here. We always want to find someone to blame. In fact, part of the scapegoat theory is kind of a sad thing here, but they've been able to identify in some research in certain parts of the world, when certain parts of our nation, when there were really bad economic times, what they were able to witness is the number of African-American male lynchings would go up when there were hard-hit economic times decades ago. So again, scapegoat theory. You want to find somebody to get the anger out on, someone to blame, and that's what this sort of unfortunately does with the scapegoat theory. All right, moving on to start wrapping things up here. A couple other things, the cognitive roots of prejudice. We have the other race effect. We tend to see uniformity in the appearance of other groups and may assume other similarities such as traits. So you may have heard of this term before: once you've met one, you've met them all. That is the other race effect in its glory. What you're basically saying there is this: you know that your group has a lot of variety and diversity in it, but someone who's not part of your group, they're basically the same individual. So that's what we sort of see that way. And then we also have judging based on vivid cases. One of the cognitive roots of prejudice, other than the other race effect, we have this idea of vivid cases. When you have a vivid case of something, that sticks in your mind more and is more easily available to you. Therefore, that sort of maintains prejudicial attitudes cognitively. And then we have the just world fallacy, believing that justice generally happens, that people get the benefits and punishments that they deserve. So these things, the other race effect, judging based on vivid cases, and the just world fallacy have been seen to sort of help support the idea of prejudicial attitudes over time. And of course, we have thinking habits, reinforced prejudice, the availability heuristic. Stereotypes are built on vivid cases, not statistics. You tend to remember the things that fit your stereotypical attitudes. You don't remember the times it doesn't. So we're not likely to look for counter examples to our stereotypes. We just let the stereotypes ride. We don't look for examples that go against them. We have hindsight bias. They should have known better, blames the victims for their misfortunes. And we also have cognitive dissonance. My culture and my family treats the people this way. How can we be wrong? If not, it causes a cognitive dissonance. So something has to change, either the behavior or your attitudes. So what we see here, there's a variety of things that continually support our prejudicial attitudes. So there are things that sort of fight against us all the time that sort of maintains prejudice. Quickly, as I wrap things up here, a couple of things I do want to cover real quickly: the idea and notion of aggression, behavior with the intent to harm other people. Just realize that we have the biological psychological and social cultural influences, a variety of things, some of which we've talked about a couple of times already, that lead to aggressive behavior. From drinking alcohol, which we've talked about before, from having aggressive role models, from parenting styles that may have corporal punishment as part of the parenting style, from seeing things on TV that may make you more aggressive, or playing more violent video games. All the research says these things do have an influence, an impact on our aggressive behavior. And a couple of other things too I want to add before I get you guys out of here is the bystander intervention. This is part of what we call pro-social relations. And pro-social relations is basically this, things that we do that positively affect people. All right, so bystander intervention or a bystander effect. Generally, the more people around, the less likely people are to help. Sounds a weird idea, but when you have a lot of people around and something happens, that is an accident or something, you're going to be less likely to intervene for a variety of reasons. One I'll bring up real quickly here is diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is this idea that if you have 100 people around, when something happens, then that responsibility for somebody doing something is divided by 100 people. But if there's only one person around, you're the only one that's going to be responsible for helping that person out. So you're more likely to help. So helping someone depends on the characteristics of the person, the situation, and your internal state. And here are some of the odds of helping are highest when the following situations are there. The person appears to need and deserve help. The person is in some way very similar to us. The person is a woman. Sounds very sexist, but women are more likely to be helped. We have just observed someone else being very helpful. For example, let's say we are leaving this big concert and there's long lines in the parking lot. You know what it is when someone stops and lets you in, okay? And then you're so happy they did that, and so you move on, and then eventually you'll stop and let somebody in. So, okay, when we've just observed someone else be helpful, that happens. We are not in a hurry. We have time to do something. We are in a small town or a rural area. The big cities, we usually don't see that as much. We are feeling guilty about something. Maybe you did something, you feel a little bit guilty, you want to get your karma back a little bit. And we are focused on others and not preoccupied, and when we are in a good mood. So when we are in a good mood, those are things that make us more likely to help other people. All right, so those are some of the main ideas I wanted to make sure that we covered for our conversation on social psychology. One other thing before I let you go, someone had asked me about some of the paper topics from the past, and I want to go ahead and communicate some of them. I just went through some of my past papers from previous classes, and here are some of the topics real quickly here. Bias against the physically dirty. That was one of the articles that someone had found. They did some their analysis of that. Coronavirus fears and mental health. COVID-19 impact on healthcare professionals, stress's impact on health, gaming saving lives during the pandemic, stress's impact on learning and memory. And I realized I didn't do this for you guys, but some people, what they did is they got a scene or a movie clip or something like that, and they did that as their assignment. You can do that if you have the time to want to do something like that. And this person did an analyzing Bojack and Sarah Lynn's relationship from the TV show Blackjack Horseman, stress making you sick, couple surviving coronavirus, appearance-based bullying and substance abuse. And this is one that got me here, the brain scene from the movie Hannibal, and short-term memory scene from the movie Finding Nemo. I think that was with Dory. So those are some of the past topics for the current event or scene papers that were done for me in the past. So if you haven't come up with a topic, one of those or something similar to those would be just fine. All right, so I'm going to stop there to see if there are any questions that anyone has about any things that we've talked about so far. You can send me a chat message or speak up. And that is a big whopping no so far. So everyone's good to go then? Can I get a yay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, since everybody's good to go, I know it's rather long today, about an hour, 15 minutes or so. So I'll go ahead and let you guys get out of here. The exam will be posted very soon along with the study guide. It'll only be covering 2 chapters this unit. Chapter 10 on motivation and chapter 12 on social psychology. All right, since that's it, I'll see you guys later.
Bye.
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 Bye.